As you probably noticed already, these arguments are not valid yet. So we need to go to the next stage and fill in the gaps with suppressed premises. Let's do that now. Let's start with the BLM's argument. Is the argument from 1 to 2 valid? Is it possible that Conoco has a lease, but it doesn't have a valid right to drill? Well, sure. And so that argument's not valid. What do we need to add to make it valid? Well, we can add a very simple suppressed premise. If Conoco does have a lease, then it has a valid right to drill. If you add that to that premise that they do have a lease, then it'll be a valid argument to the conclusion that they have a valid right to drill. Next, is the argument from 2 and 3 to 4 valid? Yes, because it's not possible that Conoco has a valid right to drill. And also, if they have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must allow them to drill. And it not be true that the BLM must allow them to drill. So we can take this part of the argument, which is really the BLM's argument, but it's in Redford's passage, and reconstruct it like this. Conoco has a lease. If they have a lease, then they have a valid right to drill, so they have a valid right to drill. And if they have a valid right to drill, then the BLM has to allow them to drill, so the BLM has to allow them to drill. Now we're ready for Redford's own argument. His goal is to refute the premise that we had to add to the BLM argument in order to make that argument valid. And in the previous lecture, we saw that a lot of people suppress premises that are questionable. And Redford wants to show how questionable this one is. He's not going to let them get away with that old trick. Starting with 1 and 2, is the argument from 1 to 2 valid? No, because it's possible that the premise is true and the conclusion false. So what do we need to add to make it valid? Well, we need to add a suppressed premise. And that suppressed premise basically says no lease that is made without sufficient environmental study and public input is valid or conveys a valid right to drill. Then we have a valid argument from that premise plus 1 to the conclusion 2 that none of Conoco's leases give it a valid right to drill. Next comes the step from 3 and 4 to 5. Is that valid? No. 3 and 4 say that they conducted an abbreviated review and they didn't look at drilling on lands and other federal leases, but those might be true, and it's still not be true that they didn't conduct a full analysis. To explain how you get 5 out of 3 and 4, we have to add another suppressed premise. And that premise can simply say an analysis is not full if it's abbreviated and if it doesn't look at drilling on lands and other federal leases. Notice that I use the word and instead of or in the suppressed premise. And the reason is that I want to make Redford's argument look as good as possible. And his premise is going to be more defensible if he uses and instead of or. Because with and, the premise means that the review is not full if it has both of those problems. Whereas if you have or, it says that the review is not full if it has either one or the other of those problems. And some people might say, if it's only got one of those problems, it's still a full review. You know, it's a little problem, it's a little flaw. But if it's got both of those problems, then Redford's on stronger ground in saying together they show that that's not a full review. So if I want to make his premise look good, and that's part of the point, then I want to use and in the suppressed premise here instead of or. What about the step from 5 to 6? Is that valid? No, here we need a suppressed premise too. Which one? Well, we could just add that if the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impact, then the permit does not give the permit holder a valid right to drill because the process by which they obtained the permit was not a proper process. Next, what about the move from 2 and 6 to 7? 2 says that Conoco doesn't have a lease that gives it a valid right to drill, and 6 says that Conoco doesn't have a permit that gives it a valid right to drill. Is it possible that both of those are true and yet the conclusion's false and Conoco does have a valid right to drill? Well, yeah, if there was some other way for it to get a valid right to drill. So, to make that argument valid, we have to add another suppressed premise, which says, basically, if the lease and the permit don't give it a valid right to drill, it ain't got none. More formally, and more stilted, we can add a suppressed premise that says, if none of Conoco's leases gives it a valid right to drill, and Conoco's permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill, then Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. And that should make that step of the argument valid. There's only one left, the step from 7 and 8 to 9. Is that valid? Yeah. It's not possible that Conoco doesn't have a valid right to drill, and if they don't have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must not allow them to drill, and not be true that the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. So that's valid, and we don't have to add any suppressed premise to that one. And now we can take all these different explicit premises and conclusions and put them together with the suppressed premises that we just talked about, and we end up with this final reconstruction. 1, all of Conoco's leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. 2, no leases that were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input give the leaseholder a valid right to drill. Therefore, none of Conoco's leases give it a valid right to drill. 4, the BLM conducted an abbreviated review. 5, the BLM didn't look at drilling on lands under other federal leases. 6, an analysis is not full if it's abbreviated, and it does not look at drilling on lands under other federal leases. Therefore, 7, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling on these incomparable lands. 8, if the BLM does not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling in these incomparable lands before issuing a permit, then that permit does not give the permit holder a valid right to drill. Therefore, 9, Conoco's permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill. 10, if none of Conoco's leases gives it a valid right to drill, and Conoco's permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill, then Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. Therefore, 11, Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. 12, if Conoco does not have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Therefore, 13, the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Of course, other reconstructions could be perfectly fine, even if they differ in a few details, because not every step in this process is purely mechanical. So it doesn't always yield exactly the same results every time. But I hope that this reconstruction seems plausible as a guess at what was going on in Redford's mind and the reasons that he had for thinking that the BLM should stop the drilling. If we want, we can check to make sure this structure makes sense by trying to diagram it. So here's a diagram that I made of the structure of the argument that I just reconstructed. To the left, you see 1 plus 2 and an underline under it saying that those premises work together in a joint structure, and an arrow to the conclusion from those two premises, namely 3. Then to the right of that, you see that 4, 5, and 6 are joined, 4 plus 5 plus 6, and an underline with an arrow to 7, because that's the conclusion that those three premises support. 7 plus 8 is then underlined to show they work jointly to lead to the conclusion 9, so there's an arrow to 9. And then there's a long underline between 3, 9, and 10, that other suppressed premise that was added. That shows that 3, 9, and 10 work together jointly and lead to the conclusion 11. And then 11 works together with 12, so you have 11 plus 12, and that's underlined with an arrow to 13. Now, the fact that we can draw this diagram confirms that the argument structure makes sense. Now, let's see whether you can do it yourself in the exercises.